In 1933, the United States government paid farmers to slaughter 6 million baby pigs, while Americans lined up at soup kitchens. Then, it paid those same farmers to evict their tenants. When those families walked to California, California made it a crime to let them in. The drought opened the door. What federal policy had already built behind it was worse. In the next 32 minutes, the 5 hidden mechanisms that turned American citizens into refugees in their own country. The laws that made this possible were not repealed. They were updated. There is a photograph most people have seen. A woman, children pressing against her shoulders, her hand raised to her jaw, not in thought but in the physical effort of holding herself upright. It became the most reproduced image of the 20th century. It was taken in March 1936 at a pea pickers camp in Nipomo, California. The photographer spent approximately 10 minutes there. She shot 6 exposures. Then she drove away. She never learned the woman's name. And the woman later said, "She didn't ask my name." To understand what happened to the Joads, you have to go back 70 years before the drought. Because the drought is not the story. The drought is the last chapter of a story that began with a law. The Homestead Act of 1862 was the federal government's solution to the unsettled West. The offer was this: 160 acres of land, free to any citizen willing to farm it for 5 years and prove their claim by cultivating it. Cultivation was not a suggestion. It was the legal requirement. To prove your claim, you had to break the ground. And so, for 7 decades, Americans moved west and plowed. What they plowed under was native mixed grass prairie, root systems that had held the topsoil of the Great Plains through thousands of years of drought and wind. Deep-rooted bluestem, buffalo grass, side oats grama, a biological anchor system that had evolved precisely for the conditions those settlers were walking into. The law required them to destroy it. In Meade County, Kansas, a homesteader named William Curry broke 320 acres of buffalo grass in the spring of 1885. He was following the law. Every family on every quarter section around him was doing the same. Between 1880 and 1930, approximately 104 million acres of native sod were broken and planted. Then came the drought, as it always has and always will on the Great Plains. The drought of the 1930s was not exceptional by geological standards. The Great Plains have experienced severe multi-decade droughts throughout their history. The archaeological record shows drought cycles spanning decades, some far longer and drier than the 1930s. What was exceptional was what happened when it arrived. The topsoil, no longer anchored by the root systems that had held it for centuries, simply left. In the hardest-hit regions, more than 75% of the topsoil was gone by the end of the decade. The Black Sunday storm of April 14, 1935, moved an estimated 300 million tons of Great Plains topsoil in a single afternoon. It turned midday into midnight across the panhandles of Oklahoma and Texas. Families packed wet rags around their window frames and still found grit in their teeth when they woke. The drought did not create the crisis. The Homestead Act had built the conditions for it over 70 years, and the drought simply revealed what was already there. The distinction matters. It matters because if the Dust Bowl was an act of God, drought plus wind, forces beyond human control, then the displacement of 250,000 people is a tragedy. If the Dust Bowl was an act of policy, law-mandated grassland destruction compounded by drought that arrived on schedule, then the displacement is something else. It is the consequence of a decision. And decisions have authors. This is the entry point. The policy created the ecological fragility. But in 1933, a second federal action turned ecological disaster into social catastrophe. While the Great Plains were losing their topsoil, the Agricultural Adjustment Act arrived with a different set of consequences. The AAA's purpose was to raise commodity prices by reducing supply. The mechanism was pay farmers to produce less. In practice, This meant paying to plow under more than 10 million acres of cotton in the same year that relief agencies were distributing rationed food to the hungry. It meant paying to slaughter approximately 6 million pigs and piglets, while soup kitchens served families who could not afford meat. Some of the pork was processed and donated through federal relief channels. The waste was not absolute, but the system that destroyed food supply while hunger spread was real, and it was federal policy. And this is where the second consequence arrives, the one the history books don't dwell on. The AAA was also supposed to compensate tenant farmers and sharecroppers when acreage was reduced. Section 7 of the Act required landowners to keep tenants on the land when they accepted payment to reduce production. In practice, that clause did almost nothing. The program was designed to send checks to whoever held title, and the people who held title were the landowners. The Mississippi Encyclopedia states it plainly: the AAA almost always sent checks to landlords, and the subsidy programs allowed plantation owners to fire some workers. The mechanism worked like this. A landowner accepts a federal payment to reduce his cotton acreage by 40%. He no longer needs the tenant farmers working that acreage. He pockets the federal check. He tells the tenant family to leave. And because the AAA's enforcement machinery was weak, and because Southern planters had enormous influence over local administration of the program, there was no practical mechanism to stop this from happening at scale. Across the South and Southwest, tenant farming families received notice and left. Some went to relatives in town, some went to relief lines. Hundreds of thousands of them drove west, through New Mexico and Arizona, through the desert, toward California. Because California was the only direction where the stories said there was work. They weren't fleeing a drought. They were fleeing a system that had found a legal mechanism to no longer need them. The drought was the reason many of them lost their homes. The AAA was the reason they couldn't come back. In Chapter 5 of the novel, a tractor driver tells Muley Graves he's been hired to push the houses down. Muley asks who gave the order. The driver says he doesn't know. Somewhere up the line, the modern reader sees a cruel landlord operating in an impersonal capitalist machine. The second-order reality is this: the landlord is operating inside a federal payment system that gave him a financial incentive to consolidate land and a structural loophole to evict the people who farmed it. The tractor isn't capitalism in the abstract. It's a federally subsidized consolidation mechanism. The machine has a return address. The families that AAA displaced had a destination. They had heard about California, the San Joaquin Valley, the orchards, the wages. Handbills circulated through Oklahoma and Texas and Arkansas. 10,000 cotton pickers wanted 40 cents an hour. The handbills were often printed by labor contractors working on behalf of California growers, issued deliberately to flood the labor market with more workers than the valley could absorb, which would allow wages to fall further. The families didn't know this. They knew that California had fruit and sun and work, and that Route 66 ran west. And so the Joads, and 250,000 people like them, loaded everything that fit into a vehicle and drove toward the state line. On February 3rd, 1936, the Los Angeles Police Department deployed 136 officers to patrol 16 checkpoints along California's borders with Arizona, Nevada, and Oregon. The Los Angeles Police Department deployed to the Arizona border, 300 miles from Los Angeles. Chief James Two Gun Davis ordered the operation. He called it a measure to protect California from what he described as an undesirable influx of vagrant labor. Davis later claimed that by March 31st, the blockade had turned back as many as 11,000 people. Historians have since questioned that number. The actual figure was likely much lower, and the checkpoints were not uniformly enforced. But the checkpoints were real, the officers were real, and the law behind them was real. California had passed an anti-indigent statute in 1933. It was a misdemeanor to bring into the state any person who was or was likely to become a public charge. In other words, it was a crime to transport a poor person across the California state line. Poverty was a deportable condition, not a background check, not a residency requirement. Poverty itself, the economic status a person carried in their wallet, was grounds for criminal exclusion from a state of the United States. For the Joads crossing into California in Chapter 18, the ragged man they meet at the border isn't a pessimist. He isn't someone who failed to succeed. He's someone who survived long enough to understand the legal regime on the other side of that line. When he tells them they aren't going to find steady work, and they aren't going to find a house to live in, he is describing statutes, not attitudes. In 1939, a man named Fred Edwards drove from California to Texas to pick up his unemployed brother-in-law, Frank Duncan. They drove back together across the California border. Edwards was arrested. He was charged with violating the anti-indigent statute. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail. Sentence suspended. 6 months in jail for giving his brother-in-law a ride, Edwards appealed. The case moved slowly. 2 years, while the law remained in force. During those 2 years, every family that crossed a California border checkpoint with a poor relation in the car was subject to arrest. The case finally reached the Supreme Court in 1941. Edwards v. California. Every justice voted to strike down the law. 9-0. Not a single dissent. Justice Robert Jackson's concurrence went further than the majority opinion. Jackson wrote that the mere status of being without money cannot be used to curtail a citizen's constitutional rights. The right to move freely between states is not a privilege that a state can revoke because a person is poor. 9 justices, 0 dissent. But here is what I want you to sit with. A man was sentenced to 6 months in jail for giving his brother-in-law a ride. I want you to think about whether any law you've encountered, in any era, in any country, is more cynical than that. Tell me in the comments. That law was real, that arrest was real, and it was just the beginning. The families who made it past the checkpoints found work, and they found that the work had been calibrated to prevent them from ever leaving it. California's agricultural labor market in the 1930s was not a market in any meaningful sense. It was a coordinated system. Grower associations, the San Joaquin Agricultural Labor Bureau among them, set standardized piece rate wages across farms so that workers couldn't negotiate by moving between employers. If one grower was paying 2 cents a box for peaches, the next grower was paying 2 cents a box for peaches. The rate was agreed in advance. The worker had no leverage because there was nowhere else to go. Wages collapsed by more than half, into the teens per hour in many crops and districts by 1933. Paul Schuster Taylor's field surveys documented the collapse. In some crops, in some seasons, workers were earning 14 cents an hour. This is the figure, 35 cents to 14 cents. That appears in the plan, in the testimony, in the field surveys. It's a confirmed directional collapse. The exact figure varied by crop and district and season, but the direction never varied. In some of the private contractor camps, workers were paid not in cash, but in scrip, tokens redeemable only at the camp's own commissary, at the camp's own prices. You couldn't take scrip to a competing market. You couldn't save it. You couldn't leave without forfeiting what you'd already earned. The system was self-contained. Arrive, work, spend yesterday's wages at the company store, return the next morning with nothing saved, work again. The math didn't need to add up. It just needed to be impossible. This is not market failure, it's market engineering. In February 1938, 1 year before he published The Grapes of Wrath, John Steinbeck drove to the San Joaquin Valley with Tom Collins, the manager of the FSA's Arvin Migratory Labor Camp. Collins had been filing weekly reports on conditions at the camp for 2 years. 30-page reports documenting illnesses, wages, songs, arguments, births. Steinbeck had been reading them. He dedicated the novel to Tom who lived it. Floods had stranded between 4,000 and 5,000 migrant families in squatter camps near Visalia and Nipomo. Steinbeck and Collins spent 2 weeks there, not as reporters, as workers, dragging people under trees for shelter, trying to find food in a region where food had run out. Steinbeck wrote afterward that these families were not just hungry, but actually starving. He wrote that many were too weak from hunger to walk a few steps toward a meal. He couldn't write about it for months. The experience broke something in the mechanism he used to turn observation into prose. When he finally could write, he said he had done his best to understate what he had seen, because he knew, anyone who had been in those camps knew, that overstating it would let people dismiss it as dramatics. Understatement was the only form of honesty left. The Associated Farmers of California was founded on March 28, 1934, organized at a meeting of the California State Chamber of Commerce and the California Farm Bureau. Its public presentation was a farmer self-defense organization, protecting agricultural interests from labor agitators and communist organizers. Its actual financial basis was something else entirely. Between May 1934 and November 1939, the Associated Farmers collected $184,231. That figure comes from the Senate investigation's own records, subpoenaed from the organization's internal books. The 10 largest contributors provided 44.3% of all funds. Those contributors were not farmers. Southern Pacific Railroad, Pacific Gas and Electric, Holly Sugar Corporation, Spreckles Investment Company, utilities, railroads, sugar corporations. The people beating migrants with pickaxe handles were funded by the electric company. In December 1939, the La Follette Committee subpoenaed the Associated Farmers' internal correspondence and funding records. It was now on the record in the United States Senate. The correspondence showed coordination with law enforcement, the funding records showed the corporations, and the testimony showed the beatings, the deportations, and the night raids on labor camps. Among the documents, internal correspondence from the Associated Farmers Imperial Valley chapter. The chapter had formally moved to explore purchasing machine guns for the local sheriff's office. This was not a fringe suggestion made by one bad actor. It moved through AF organizational channels and appeared in committee testimony. The organization that had branded the Grapes of Wrath as communist propaganda was, on the record, proposing heavy weapons for civilian law enforcement to use against farm workers. And then there are the lawyers. ACLU counsel A.L. Wirren was sent to the Imperial Valley to represent farm workers. He was kidnapped by a group of men, beaten, and left in the desert outside of town. 3 other ACLU representatives were seized and beaten in the same campaign. Ernest Bizig, who investigated Imperial Valley conditions for the ACLU, was beaten in this context. The Calexo Chronicle covered the attacks. The La Follette Committee placed them in the record. 0 prosecutions followed any of these incidents. In Chapter 20, a deputy fires into a migrant camp and vigilantes burn it to the ground. The modern reader sees a chaotic riot, local anger boiling over. The deputy isn't a rogue actor, he's executing policy. And the men who help him aren't a mob. They're a militia, funded by Pacific Gas and Electric. This was standard operating procedure, documented and repeated across California's agricultural valleys. The reason 0 prosecutions followed is not a mystery. The Peace Officers Association of the State of California had officially endorsed, in writing, the cooperation and mobilization of civilian groups to combat subversive activity. Read that again. The Professional Association of California's law enforcement personnel had put its institutional signature on a document endorsing organized civilian violence against labor organizers. The Associated Farmers wasn't operating in the shadows. It had a letter of endorsement from the state's own peace officers. In August 1939, the same month the Grapes of Wrath was selling 2,000 copies a week nationwide, the Kern County Board of Supervisors voted to ban it from every library and school in the county. The vote was August 21st, 1939. The ban lasted until January 1941. Over 600 residents were on waiting lists to read it. Librarian Gretchen Keeve had ordered 60 copies. She was forced to pull them from the shelves. The official justification for the ban was that the novel was inaccurate and defamatory. The Associated Farmers' preferred description was communist propaganda. The Kern County supervisors agreed. Here is what Kern County is. Kern County is in the San Joaquin Valley. It is one of the primary locations where the Associated Farmers had operated. It is where labor camps were raided. It is where organizers were beaten. It is where vigilante groups had coordinated with law enforcement under the Peace Officers Association's endorsement. The Grapes of Wrath was banned in the county, where the events it depicted had occurred, by the political representatives of the institutions it accused, for the crime of describing what they had done. The people who burned the book were the people the book was about, and they knew it. That's why they burned it. In March 1936, Dorothea Lange was driving back from a field assignment in Napomo, California, when she passed a sign for a pea pickers camp. She had been photographing migrant labor conditions for the Resettlement Administration, the federal agency that would later become the Farm Security Administration. She almost didn't stop. She had her footage. She was tired. She drove past the sign. Then she turned around. Lange spent approximately 10 minutes at the camp. She talked briefly with the woman at the center of it, a woman with children around her, in a lean-to shelter, at a table with almost nothing on it. Lange later said that she and the woman spoke hardly at all. She shot 6 exposures. She thanked the woman and left. She did not ask her name. She did not get a mailing address. She told the woman she would not sell the pictures. She said she would send a copy. She never did. The photograph, the 5th exposure, the one the world knows, was transmitted to the San Francisco News within days. It ran on the front page. It was reprinted in papers across the country. The federal government used it to justify emergency relief funding for migrant camps. It became the most recognizable photograph of the Great Depression. It became, for many people, the most recognizable photograph of the century. The woman's name was not attached to it. Not in the caption, not in the news service wire, not in the government reports that used it to justify policy. The Resettlement Administration classified the image as a government work and placed it in the public domain. It appeared in hundreds of books, in government publications, in museum exhibitions, in educational materials. Licenses were never acquired because the government owned it, and the woman in it received nothing. Not a cent, not a credit, not a name. Her name was Florence Leona Christie. She was born in 1903. She was of Cherokee descent. She had married a man named Cleo Owens. He died young, and had later taken a partner named George Thompson, whose surname she carried. By 1936, she was a widow in her early 30s with 7 children, picking peas in a camp with no money, no shelter beyond the lean-to, and no legal path back to anything that resembled stability. She was not a symbol, she was a person, and for 42 years, she was the most famous unidentified face in America. In 1978, a reporter named Emmett Corrigan identified her. He matched her face to the photograph, tracked her down, and published her name, Florence Owens Thompson. She was living in California. Still, she was 75 years old. She was not grateful for the recognition. She told reporters, "I wish she hadn't taken my picture. I can't get a penny out of it. She got famous off of it." And she said this, "She didn't ask my name." The erasure operated on 3 levels simultaneously, and it is worth naming them, one by one. The first erasure was personal. Lang did not ask her name. The wire services did not ask her name. The government did not ask her name. She was a visual argument, proof that conditions were bad enough to justify federal relief. And visual arguments do not require names. The second erasure was racial. Florence Thompson was a woman of Cherokee descent, and the narrative machine that made her photograph famous depended on not saying so. The historian Paul Taylor, who worked alongside Lang documenting migrant conditions, noted explicitly that the white skin and Anglo-Saxon names of the Dust Bowl migrants could win attention and sympathy that would not so readily attach to the Mexican and Asian farm workers who normally struggled. In the valleys of California, the iconic face of white American suffering was an indigenous woman. The story the photograph was used to tell required that fact to remain invisible. Consider what this means inside the frame of everything we have examined. The Dust Bowl migration was framed, in its own moment and in its cultural memory afterward, as a distinctly white American story, American citizens, American families, displaced on American soil. The legal argument in Edwards v. California was built on the rights of citizens. The novel's central family is white and Oklahoman. The sympathy the photograph generated was grounded in the perceived whiteness of the figure at its center. And she was Cherokee. The entire architecture of public compassion, the editorial decisions, the relief funding, the cultural memory was built on a face that was being read as something it was not. The erasure was not incidental. It was load-bearing. The third erasure was economic. Because the photograph was taken for a federal agency, it was classified as a public domain work. Florence Thompson owned nothing. The image that had been reproduced in thousands of contexts, licensed to publishers and government bodies and exhibition organizers, had generated enormous value, none of which could reach her. She had no legal claim to a cent of it. In 1983, Florence Thompson was dying of cancer and heart disease. Her children could not cover her medical bills. They publicly solicited donations. Thousands of letters arrived. $35,000 came in. It was not enough. She died on September 16th, 1983, at age 80. The novel ends with Rose of Sharon, who has just lost her baby, offering her breast to a dying stranger in a barn. Steinbeck called it radical generosity, the act of sharing what you have when you have nothing left. It is the emotional terminus of every argument he made in 408 pages about what poverty does to people and what people do to each other inside it. But there is something that happens when you know Florence Thompson's name and know what happened to her. The image of radical generosity at the center of Steinbeck's final chapter hits differently. Because the real iconic mother of the Great Depression, the woman whose face was used to represent exactly this suffering, this dignity under erasure, was herself denied the most basic human recognition, the recognition of being known by her own name, and the recognition of belonging to her own people. The drought opened the door. What federal policy had already built behind it was worse. A land system that destroyed the ecological conditions for survival. A federal payment program that funded evictions. A state that made poverty a deportable condition and sent armed police to enforce it. A wage structure engineered to prevent exit. A corporate-funded paramilitary organization with a letter of endorsement from the state's own peace officers. And the most recognized face in the country, uncompensated, unidentified, unasked. This is not a story about bad weather. It never was. She didn't ask my name.